Well, to start our day, we're going to dig into what demographic and economic shifts are going to mean for California agriculture in the coming years, especially tree nuts and horticulture. And joining us are two economists who have been closely tracking the trends and the implications of population changes and the other economic factors, including trade policy that are affecting or going to affect California. So please join me in welcoming Matt Woolf, specialty crop analyst at Terrain, and David Magaña, senior vice president and analyst at Rabobank. And we're going to start with Matt Woolf to lead us through the future when it comes to population trends and what that means for agriculture. Matt?
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. First of all, thanks so much to Sarah and the rest of the Agri-Pulse team. I always leave this event feeling a lot smarter, which is always a good sign of time well spent. Today, I want to talk about a risk that I don't think we talk about enough. This is a risk to the global economy and also to agriculture more broadly. And it's a risk that we've been following quite a bit at Terrain, and Terrain's a group of economists that work within the farm credit system. It's something we've been following in a series called The Big Shrink, where we look at demographic changes over time, and we look at our own population trends going forward, and then also their impact on agriculture. And that risk is fundamentally the fact that the population is expected to peak sometime in the 21st century. And so what I want to do today is just walk you through this series so far, where again, I look at the historical linkage here, particularly in the 20th century and the 21st century, look at our own population projections and what it means for our industry. Linking the history of agriculture with the history of demographic trends, I'm going to start with the baby boom here. The defining demographic event of the 20th century is the baby boom. That's when servicemen came back from fighting World War II, and we saw family formation take off in a way it really hadn't before. Fertility rates jump up in a way they had never done before. And one of the things we often forget about that time is how much the intellectual and economists, policymakers, zeitgeist was concerned about the ability of the agriculture system and the food system to keep up with that many people. So you get books like The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich at Stanford, which predicted mass famine as early as the 1980s. This was a very serious book at the time that was causing a lot of waves and caused a lot of concern among policymakers. One of those policymakers was Earl Butz, who would eventually become Secretary of Agriculture in the 1970s, who really encouraged the industry to lean in to our productive capacity on the supply side while building demand and export markets on the demand side, by really strengthening what those export markets once were. This caused two things to happen. Number one, it was really good for the world. We saw poverty rates generally go in a downward direction throughout this period. It was also good for farmers. Land values appreciated, ag productivity tripled, agricultural exports increased about 25-fold. We also got this idea or narrative in the industry of feed the world. Feeding the world as the world grows is good for the industry as we're able to export more and demand steadily increases year over year. If the defining demographic event of the 20th century was the baby boom, the defining event of the 21st century is baby bust. Fertility rates have fallen to record lows in most parts of the world. Europe is now in population decline. China is in population decline. Japan, South Korea, and you can go on and on. This has also made it much more difficult to project forward what the population might do. As fertility rates continue to drop well below what most economists or demographers expect, it's become very difficult to know what population at the global level or the continent level might do in the next 10 years or next 15 years. And so the UN, for example, which is kind of the gold standard of population projections, has continually revised their estimates downward. since about 2017. And in 2022, they defined their first peak in the 21st century. We wanted to understand how sensitive those projections were to changes in the fertility rate, number one. And then also what happens if you just continue the decline in the fertility rate going forward. And what happens is population projections are quite sensitive to changes in the fertility rate, number one. And then number two, if you just extend the trend outward, you get a number about 9.4 billion by 2065 relative to the UN's number, which is about 10.3 billion in 2084. Whichever estimate you happen to like more, one thing is very clear from this chart is that for the first time in human history, the world population will enter a sustained decline sometime in the second half of this century, which is pretty astounding and pretty significant. You know, the global population has gone into decline at various points in time, whether that was due to war, whether that was due to a plague, but this will be the first time that it is in sustained decline, which is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. So think about what that means for this idea of feed the world. What does this mean for economic growth, which often relies on larger consumer markets and larger working populations? Something that's going to come along well before the population actually reaches peak is population aging. As the fertility rate drops, what we tend to see is fewer babies replacing older individuals. And so the population gets older. So the proportion of people that are in retirement age becomes greater relative to the people in working age. So in 2025, there are 6 working age people for every 1 retiree. In 2050, there will be 4 working age people for every 1 retiree. And in 2100, there will be 2 working age people for every 1 retiree. So again, when we think about public pensions, which often rely on taxing working age people, it means fewer people to tax to support dependents over time. Okay, so what does this all mean for agriculture? Of course, that's why we're all here. I think a lot of you are probably thinking, well, what does this mean for trade? So this chart shows the percent of trade value going to shrinking countries over time, and I do it for almonds, I do it for pistachios, pecans, walnuts, and in total ag value. If you look at the early 1990s, there were very little of trade value was going to countries that were experiencing population shrinkage. As you get to the early 2000s, Germany starts shrinking a little bit. Other Eastern Europeans go the same direction, so it goes upwards. 2009, that's Japan, which enters population decline then. 2020, that's China, that's Europe, South Korea. And if you just extrapolate outwards, you very quickly get to a point not so far into the future here, where roughly 100% of our trade value, again, as a total ag industry, and then also in these submarkets, roughly 100% will be going to countries that are experiencing population decline. I mentioned population aging. That will come before we actually enter population decline. In fact, most economies are already experiencing population aging at a pretty rapid clip. Population aging in and of itself can have impacts to demand as well. This chart here is a bell-shaped curve which shows food spending across different commodities by age. So when under 24, maybe you're still in college, you're not spending a whole lot on food because you don't have a job. Maybe you're spending on cheap beer or pizza. I don't really know what college kids eat anymore. I'm done with that part of my life. 25 to 34, maybe you have your first child, maybe you're working your first job, more disposable income, you're able to spend more on food. 35 to 44, you're in your almost to your peak earning potential, maybe you have some more children, you're spending quite a bit on food relative to other ages. 45 to 54, same idea. And then as you get into these older categories, you tend to spend less on food. Couple reasons for that. Number one, you might be living on a fixed income. Number two, living a less active lifestyle. Number three, changes to the body affect metabolism, typically demand more food from that perspective as well. So I think it's really important to think about what it means for more of our consumer base and more of the population not to be represented by the middle part of this chart, but by the right-hand side. Now, one of the problems with economists is we always talk about problems and trends and data and risks, and we don't get invited to parties because of that. It can be very sad. So I also want to talk about the opportunity here, because I do think there's an opportunity as well. And I can really think of three that come to mind. And one is to really focus on innovation as an industry. I think this chart gets it that well. Innovation can be value added, right? This shows what corn and corn product exports looked like in 1990 compared to 2024. In 1990, there was mostly represented by bulk and seed, and over time, we've seen value added and innovation result in a lot more demand due to ethanol, DDGs, oil, bran flour, etc. If you think about the almond industry is a great example of this. You know, almonds are now in roughly every aisle of the grocery store, from almond oil, cereals, candy bars, etc. So I think continuing to build that demand per capita is going to be really important going forward. Number two is to really target those export markets that have a positive demographic story to tell. It's true that fertility rates are essentially declining everywhere, but there are some countries and some regions that are better off, that may be really valuable to focus on those, that have a positive income story and a demographic story. And then number three is more at the farmer level, and that's instead of thinking of our land base as an asset off of which we grow commodities, thinking of our land base as a commodity off of which we grow revenue. So I see that as more diversification, using marginal acres for more cash flow, whether that's through solar, whether that's through agritourism, what have you. But these are the three opportunities that I see as we think about this population risk. And just one thing, I think sometimes this can feel very far off, right? We're talking about second half of the 21st century. That's a long time from now. To quote Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead. But in economics, things tend to happen. Things tend to take longer than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Matt. With that, before we go to David, I want to remind you to start getting your questions in on Slido. I'm going to have plenty of questions. I already have several for Matt, but you don't want to just listen to me. So get your questions in on Slido, and with that, we'll turn to David.
Thank you. I've spoken a few times before in this summit, and one advantage, at least for me, of speaking to a familiar audience is that I don't have to explain that my presentation does not contain subtitles, nor closed captions, or simultaneous translation. So you have to put up with my accent. So having said that, they asked me to deliver a 20-minute presentation or 15 or something like that. I prepared 120 slides, then I come down to 40. I will try to cover all those in the next few minutes, so hang on tight. So first, we are facing a blend of new, in quotes, and old things. So things that we've seen in the headlines in the past few months over and over is uncertainty, tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, trade wars, MAGA, things like that. But still, for agribusiness, for consumers, for companies, we still care about what that means for the same old economic variables, specifically inflation, interest rates, exchange rates, consumer confidence, and long-term planning, which long-term planning now has a different meaning. Usually, as Matt was just saying, long-term can mean by the end of this century, but nowadays it seems like long-term is 90 days or just a few months. So that definition has been changing. Just briefly over inflation, you know that over the past few months, inflation has come down significantly to about 2.5%. In other situations, that would have been a thing to celebrate, right? But now we have a lot of moving pieces, still interest rates expected to be higher for longer, and exchange rates. An interesting thing, after the November election, we were doing the analysis on the potential implications for policies to be implemented by this administration, including potential massive deportations and increasing tariffs. And that is inflationary, that could lead to increasing interest rates and stronger US dollar. On the other hand, we have potential policies that could be helping businesses and economic growth, like potential tax cuts, and as probably we were discussing at the time, some support programs for some segments of the economy. And that on that side is what's going to supposed to be promoting economic growth. And then that's inflationary, which could lead to higher interest rates and a stronger dollar again, right? But what we've seen since November is that the US dollar has been depreciating up to 10% from November to recent days. And that is because of the all other moving pieces happening, including the increasing fiscal deficit and things like that. So things are moving faster than we can even now monitor, and usually our assumptions are usually wrong, and we got that wrong as well. Not a stronger dollar, at least not in the past few months, and that has significant implications for trade. And trade has been a significant topic. Now, if back to International Economics 101, these are the basics of what a tariff is expected to do in the economy. So we have on the left panel this exporting country that they have a domestic low price, and on the right-hand side we have the importing country higher price. And then if we have free trade agreement, we have free trade, then you have a price that is better for everyone in the economy. Then if they impose an import tariff, then that is the lines in blue. You have the exporters are likely to receive lower prices than in free trade agreement, and the importing country is going to have higher prices. No surprise there. So, but the government is getting some revenue. And if the government wants to keep that revenue going, that means that imports will have to continue to flow, which kind of contradicts the idea of imposing a tariff and having some benefits out of that. Anyway, that's just basically reduced trade, higher prices for consumers, and the government gets some revenue out of that. And talking about trade, let's review a few numbers about the trends in the past couple of decades. So we've seen increasing trade, both in exports and on US imports. That is total food and ag for US. And as you see on the export side, Mexico, Canada, and China account for about 50% of the value of US exports. On the import side, you have total agricultural imports. Mexico and Canada account for almost half of that. And we're going to just do a double click fast on this one as well. With which sectors have been contributing to this trade? This is the net trade balance. So trade balance by sector. Obviously, the US continues to have a positive trade balance for grains, oilseeds, dairy, things like that. But when you see horticultural products, we have the negative trade balance continue to be increasingly negative. And overall, if you see the dotted line, that is the total US food and ag trade balance. In the past few years, that has come to negative numbers. So now, the US is a net importer of food by this metric, right? So now we're importing more in terms of value, because we're importing more like higher value and exporting grains, oilseeds, things like that. But horticultural sector is quite interesting because that provides an example of a specialization. Economic theory predicts that under free trade, you're gonna focus, you're gonna specialize on what you do best, and you're gonna trade the rest, right? And then here we see that example. So increasing negative trade balance for fruits and preparations, vegetables and preparations, probably no surprise there, and other horticultural products, which includes flowers, ornamentals, and also other beverages such as beer and tequila. And that also has been increasingly negative. But on the other hand, tree nuts and preparations, the US continues to have a trade surplus on that, given the comparative advantages. So this is an example of specialization and trade in this specific sector. Now, just a brief review of the dynamics in terms of fresh fruit availability and consumption in the US. After all these trade dynamics that we've been observing over the past couple of decades, now we see increasing availability of fresh fruit in the US, particularly because now we have a more consistent year-round availability. So on the right-hand side, you see the dynamics in the past decade. Which fruits we've seen with higher availability in the US, basically raspberries, blueberries, easy peel citrus, and other tropicals. While tropicals are not a surprise, now we've seen that even when you consider all the consumption in the US, for some industries, now imports in the past few years have surpassed domestic production. That has happened in blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, and also in table grapes. So this more consistent year-round availability that consumers have been demanding. Looking specifically at tree nuts, in tree nuts we see an increasing availability in the US market for almonds, pistachios, things like that, but this industry continues to rely heavily on exports, as about 70% of the crop is exported. So you see on the right-hand side, the exports in terms of value for almonds, pecans, and pistachios, things like that. Now, in terms of almonds, we've seen something quite, an example of what these trade wars mean for US exports. US almonds have been facing tariffs going into China since 2019. And now we've seen, like, at least for shelled almonds, that Vietnam has become the primary destination, and China has been declining in terms of the share of US almond exports. So the industry is doing a good job in diversifying markets and trying to avoid these tariffs. But tariffs are still going to be impacting a lot what has been happening. So just to finish this segment, I will just do a double click in a specific tree nut industries. And this is just the dynamics that we've been observing in the almond industry. As you know, inventories have been a problem over the past few years, which highlights that not only population, but a lot of different factors impact the profitability of California industries, including the logistics, including elevated inflation that impacts consumer confidence and consumers trading down. That has been impacting the tree nut industry globally in the past few years. But starting last season, we saw a significant decline in inventories at the end of the marketing season, and that has been supporting prices to multi-year highs in almonds. So despite all the challenges, despite all the trade wars, now prices are recovering for almonds. And pistachios, that industry that is probably the fastest growing industry in California. A lot of plantings over the past decade, from 2012 to 2022, about 30,000 new acres were planted a year. So now we are likely to see that bearing acreage flattening out by the end of this decade, between 500,000 and 600,000, and we will continue to see more pistachios hitting the market, but the industry is also doing a good job in promoting those, pistachios globally, so market access will continue to be key. In walnuts, we're expecting to see flat to declining acreage, and then not only in California, but also in places like Chile, as the industry has been facing significant challenges. So in the next few years, probably a more balanced supply-demand situation that is expected to provide some price support for the industry, much needed. And given, I'm going to skip the rest. These were avocados. I was going to just point out the very strong demand for avocados in the U.S. Lower supplies this year coming from Mexico due to weather events, not related to tariffs. And the California industry is harvesting in 2025 the largest crop since 2020, and very good prices. But the industry is also facing some challenges, some constraints to grow and take advantage of that. For example, new plantings are expected to be delayed, as nurseries have a delay of about 2 years to deliver new trees, and also cost of land and water regulation, and as we saw before, that continues to be a constraint for California industry. So just to end, so we will continue to face some constraints, as we saw in the survey earlier today, labor, water, regulation, that will continue to be a challenge. But at the same time, we will continue to have new tools at our disposal, particularly innovation, and a lot of things happening on things that we cannot control. But we should focus on what we can do. I'm just using the cost-benefit analysis there. Probably we cannot do much about interest rates and things like that, but we can do a lot on being more efficient, innovation, and to be as efficient as possible. And with that, I will go back to the next stage of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You've set up a lot of questions there. And speaking of questions, we've got about 20 minutes left, so get your questions in on Slido. I want to start with you, Matt. There's a lot to think about there with around the big shrink in declining populations, fertility rates in populations. But how does, you mentioned income, how does rising incomes in many cases go along with falling fertility rates? So how does that play in terms of ultimately affecting demand for California agriculture?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the biggest, I think, pushback is, it's one thing to talk about the number of consumers, but the incomes of those consumers is also very important. And, I totally grant that. It's definitely a great predictor. A few things. Typically, you don't see food spending and food demand increase in proportion with your income. It tends to increase at low levels of income, but then it kind of flattens out. Another way of saying that is Bill Gates has a lot more money than I do, but he probably doesn't spend that much more proportionally on food. And then the second thing is, if you forecast out some of these trends in some of these really large markets, I think it's going to be substantial enough that this plays a role beyond income. So you take China, for instance, By the end of this century, China is expected to have roughly 800 million fewer people, which is more than 2 US's. I think no matter what you say about income, I think income matters. I think when you have 800 million fewer consumers, that's going to make a difference.
David, do you see any opportunities there for fruits and vegetables, or is this in tree nuts, or is this a decline that's going to affect?
Well, I agree with Matt in the sense that probably from one level of income and above, like income is not a relevant factor when you when talking about food, but it does make a difference when you are transitioning from low income or even below the poverty line and to the middle class. And we've seen a significant increase in the middle class population, particularly in Asia Pacific. And so we were discussing for years like that the world is going to be needing not only more food, but different type of food. So given that change from low income to middle class level, and that will likely to be helping with the demand for the type of products that California is exporting. So not only low value commodities, but what California is basically exporting are not necessities. We have to face that, right? It was very clear during 21, 22, when we had persistent elevated inflation. In many countries, like consumers were trading down. So not buying as many almonds as before, because almonds is a great product, but it's not a necessity. It's, you can live without eating the products that California is exporting. So those are nice to haves, and the increase in middle class probably is gonna help with that. Also, the 60-year-old today probably is not gonna have, on average, for example, in India, is not gonna have the same consumption pattern than the 60-year-old in 40 years, given that they are growing with different income levels and different expectations and different eating patterns as well. So I see that as a silver lining that will continue to be promoting California, demand for California products globally. But now, as I said before, now we should be worried more about other aspects, like we have a lot of supply side constraints, even here in, here in the state, and we were likely to see like also more demand in the U.S. market, as we saw like now the U.S. is now a net importer of food when you consider all the value, right?
Matt, we have a couple of questions having to do with the population projections. One has to do with Africa. That's the one region is expected to buck the trend in terms of continued increase in fertility rates. And then another one is another questioner is about India and its potential to replace China in terms of a major export market. And David, I want you to address India as well. Matt?
Yeah, so on Africa, Africa has the highest fertility rates today, but they are going in a downward trajectory pretty quickly. I definitely see Africa as a potential future market, and India. I think Africa today represents about 20% of the population. I think at the end of the century, they're going to be roughly 40%, so kind of knocking on the door of half, of the world population if you just project outward. So I definitely see those two as really big opportunities. In the nut industry, you hear a lot about the challenges with, say, selling pistachios in India. It's very difficult to figure out their distribution, et cetera. So it definitely comes with challenges, right? India historically has been more protectionist than China. That could be a constraint as well. But definitely, I see those as big future markets. When I was talking about building or being more strategic about our export markets as well, Two that have come to mind for me are Brazil and Indonesia. We don't export that much to those countries, and you might say, well, Brazil and Indonesia, that seems random. But those are two of the most populous countries. They have a pretty good income story to tell as well. They're both upper middle income classification from the World Bank, which means that they have a developed middle class that's continuing to develop in very high economic growth. So I absolutely see those as opportunities going forward.
Is there going to be enough income growth in Africa in particular to make a difference in terms of an export market, export potential?
Yeah, I think so. I imagine you're going to have a lot of the same challenges that exporters have in India, though, trying to develop that market. Africa also has a history of being more protectionist than China, kind of like India in that respect. And then Africa obviously has its own challenges. So I think that's where I think there is an opportunity there. But we've talked as an industry about Africa and India for quite a long time, and there are challenges that go along with that.
David, well, what do you see, particularly in India, in terms of prospects?
Well, India is an interesting market with a huge potential. They have their own challenges, obviously, and potential is, high tariffs, for example, for walnuts and other products is a thing, and but given the increasing population still in India, and more importantly, the increasing middle class, that will continue to drive demand. And also keep in mind that a good proportion of Indian consumers, they prefer plant proteins, so that's a good aspect for tree nuts. But I would like also to see all this realignment in terms of trade, and that will probably be impacting more than compensating for the changes in population, right? As now we see more free trade agreements with Asia and Latin America, particularly China, with other countries, we will see how that is gonna play out. And now we see that, for example, China is becoming a net exporter of walnuts now and table grapes, and they are the largest producer now of even blueberries and other products. So we will have more competition as well. And now China is building a net of free trade agreements that will help their market, and also having other products, providing competing products for China and for other Asian markets, right? As I was hearing an interesting analogy in terms of trade and all this realignment is like, for example, in England, they invented soccer or football, right? So they invented the sport that Brazilians could win the world championship, right? Now we've seen since World War II, the U.S. promoting free trade, and now we're seeing that China is probably winning on that front. So we will see this realignment as we continue to see this deglobalization trend, as some people call it.
Okay. Continuing on that thought, this would make a great closing question, but it really gets to the heart of this. Given the rising population from today until 2065, as you've talked about, Matt, followed by a decline, how do we manage today's growth, knowing that decline may be ahead?
Yeah, I think
especially if you're a farmer in your 30s and
right.
20s, 30s, and 40s.
Right. It's a great question. I mean, I think that question applies at different levels. If you're at the kind of global marketing level of the industry, I think it's all about being really strategic about those export partners that are going to, again, have a positive income story and positive demographic story to tell. Number two, innovation, I think, is going to be really key there. And then, I think at the farmer level, I think it might be about, growing high value as opposed to high volume. And that's somewhat vague, but I think that's going to be really important going forward. Yeah, it is challenging to think about, the growth right before you get to decline. That's a challenging way to put it. And then I guess the final thing there is just to think about who your consumer is. If your consumer looks a lot older, it might be important to market to them in that way. Another thing that we haven't really touched on is the whole Ozempic deal, right? And how that might play into all this. And that's one area that, when David was talking about what we grow here in California, that I think we might be actually in a better position from that point of view. There's recent research that found where or what ag goods were consumed the least as a result of that, and fruits, vegetables, nuts took a little bit of a hit, but it wasn't like crazy like some of the other commodities. So I think that's going to be important going forward. And then it's the same with older individuals. I showed that chart about food spending among older individuals. Older individuals tend to spend less on all of those, but they actually increase their quantities of fruits and vegetables and nuts more as they get into old age. So there's just a little bit of a nuance there.
David, how do you think the industry should think about this long-term trend and prepare for it?
Well, I think it all starts in the short run, right? Like now we've seen now changes happening faster and faster, and probably thinking in 2 decades, that's probably, we don't know like where we're gonna be. But what we will see is the level of adoption of new technologies is gonna happen increasingly fast. So now with AI, automation, things like that, we've seen now significant and very interesting applications in agriculture. And as labor and water will continue to be a challenge, now all this automation and all this application and of new technologies, that will help to provide a solution for farmers in starting now and in the next few years, and going forward more into the longer run.
We'd be remiss not to talk a little bit about trade here and the current issues around tariffs. The president's policy, his goal is to obviously reshore a lot of production across the economy, including agriculture. He's talked about that. Are there any real opportunities, David, to reshore any fruit and vegetable production?
In fruits and vegetables, well, that's an interesting, and depending on the crop, because we're talking about a very diversified sector, right? On fruits, obviously, no surprise, the U.S. has been relying on imports for tropical fruits. But as I said before, now we see more consistent year-round availability of a lot of fruits now, compared just to 15 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, we didn't see blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, and strawberries every single week of the year in every supermarket, or easy peel citrus, or table grapes, or avocados, things like that. And now the U.S. has some opportunity to continue to develop the industry, but we have a strong seasonality in many of those seasons. And for example, in blueberries, like 80% of the imports happen during the U.S. off-season. So there is not a lot that you can do during the U.S. off-season. And on the other hand, all those increasing level of imports and more consistent availability, that has been creating demand for the category. So you have, depending on the specific industry, there is some limited opportunity, particularly during the overlap of the California season with the import season. And now, if you go to vegetables, you have some some commodities where the U.S. now heavily relies on imports, particularly cucumbers, bell peppers, and tomatoes. And tomatoes is a hot topic now, right, given that the U.S. is planning to terminate the suspension agreement next month and impose a 21% duty for Mexican tomatoes. And just as a backdrop, 20 years ago, 7 out of 10 tomatoes consumed in the U.S. were grown in the U.S. Nowadays, 7 out of 10 tomatoes consumed in the U.S. are imported, and from all imports, 9 out of 10 come from Mexico, and the other 10% comes from Canada. But you have still some other segment of the vegetable industry, for example, leafy greens, where the reliance on imports is very, very limited. And probably in terms of trade, as we said, we have some of these more like shelf-stable products like tree nuts, where the U.S. is a net exporter, probably like opening new markets and having better trade deals. That's where the opportunity lies.
You're talking about fresh market tomatoes, right?
Fresh market tomatoes, yeah, that's a big difference. Two very non-overlapping industries that the only thing to share is mostly just the name tomatoes, right? Because like on one, the U.S. is a net exporter, and the other, on the fresh market, is a net importer. And I just like happened to have a detailed presentation last week about the difference of fresh market tomatoes and processing tomatoes, and very, very fascinating industry. So.
We have a question about the Make America Healthy Again movement, MAHA, what the administration is doing in that regard under Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. Can we expect any change in consumption patterns? Could that be good for fruits and vegetables and tree nuts? What do you all see?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, my approach to that sort of news is, I don't agonize, I analyze. So something like that, until we start to see an impact, I really don't know where that might be going as far as consumption is concerned. I mean, where my mind goes is on the pesticide front, of the impact existing there. But I don't know, David, do you have anything there?
Well, probably like usually fresh produce and tree nuts have this healthy halo, and that should be helping with this movement. But more importantly, and probably an impact that we're already seeing, on the demand for food given the anti-obesity medication. Right now, that has been really ramping up, and consumers really feel less hungry. And that is potentially a disruptor for the industry, and particularly on what type of food they will be consuming and things like that. And having said that, all other factors that are impacting already the industry, for example, the wine industry, is that younger consumers are drinking less than in previous generations, and that has been impacting the wine industry and other industries as well. And now we see a global oversupply of wine, and that is we see that pressure clearly here in California as well.
Well, that's going to have to be the final question, the final word. Join me in thanking Matt and David for being with us. Thank you again. Before we transition into our next session, we'd like to take a moment to recognize our luncheon and reception sponsor, the Almond Board of California. We appreciate your support.
California's almond industry began with the energy and grit of 1850s Western pioneers. Through its 170 years, it's grown into a global powerhouse with so much to be proud of, including an enduring spirit of resilience, ingenuity, toughness, and community that carries on today.
The community here locally of almond growers is so tight-knit. To be a part of that is pretty special. when my dad was sick. And I had 2 farmers. They came and he came out and helped me with the harvest. So to just help us get through. And we would do the same thing back for whoever needed help.
There's a sense amongst people that if we join together, we can get through it, we can do it. And a lot of that is what keeps people going.
Through all the challenges, there are constants in the industry, starting with a willingness to work hard.
It was a lot of physical labor back then. Of course, the crop was minuscule compared to what it is now, but physical labor, those people worked hard and to get it done.
In the 50s and even 1960, there was less than 100,000 acres of almonds. In the 70s, it went crazy. A lot had to do with the fact that you could mechanically harvest them now, whereas before it'd be so labor intensive that it wasn't even attractive.
The lessons from all of those years are a cornerstone of the industry, what it's achieving today and how growers are facing challenges to achieve even more tomorrow.
It's a generation that hasn't seen this, so it's a real learning experience. They can be told about it from their fathers and grandfathers, but until you really experience it, growers are so resilient and they can do so much themselves. It's a great community.
If you're going to grow almonds, you just do what you have to do to keep going.
And plus, it's so rewarding just to produce a really good product for other people to consume. A lot of pride that should come from that.